Notebook 15. The 296th returns to Champagne. From the 30th of January, 1917, to the 26th of April, 1917. Part 1. Last time we left as Barthas reached the village of Dommartin-sur-Ain in the Champagne sector, where his regiment had been relocated. Shortly after his arrival, some shells fell on the town, with one of these falling in the middle of a corral with mules and horses, killing one of the beasts and injuring two others to the point they were finished off with a pistol as a mercy. We shall now see what happened after that. As was previously mentioned, for the next few days the soldiers enjoyed steaks made with cuts of meat obtained from the dead animals. Fraze, the fat comrade from one of the other gun teams, was particularly happy with all the food. His belly expanded several centimeters, and his cheerful, optimistic personality was fortified. With his jokes and lively expressions, he lifted the spirits of many of the anxious poilus. In his eternal quest to find more food, Fraze decided one day to go out and hunt for sparrows, but all he returned with was a small owl. After killing and plucking the bird, the poilus discovered that the animal was so skinny that when one pressed its belly, it squeaked like a small baby. Fraze had some fun with this, as he went out towards groups of soldiers that were going to their billets and pressing the dead owl next to them. The soldiers would get very surprised and confused at hearing what seemed like the whimpers of a newborn in the ruined town. After some entertainment with the dead owl, it ended up in Fraze's belly, together with a mule and horse meat. The day after Barthas' arrival, his gun team returned from the trenches to rest in the nice house that served as their billets. The house belonged to a short and unpleasant 75-year-old woman who was still very alert despite her age. She lived elsewhere in the village with her son, but 20 times a day she would go into the house and meticulously check every corner of the house and its furniture to make sure nothing had been damaged. Barthas and the other poilus welcomed her arrival with curses in their own southern dialect. The woman threatened to evict them if anything was damaged, and in fact she once appealed to the officer in charge of the town to kick them out because the smoke of their fires was darkening her ceiling and walls. As there was nowhere else to stay, the poilus remained in that house, but from that day on they could only light their fires in a single, cold, out-of-the-way room. Additionally, the old woman never stopped complaining about the Germans, who in 1914 had occupied that home for 2 weeks. Barthas wrote that she would have easily forgiven all the atrocities the Germans had done in Belgium, but she would never forgive the fact that they had broken the panel of one of her wardrobes and stolen a soup bowl. Barthas added that some time later the shelling of the town increased to the point that the villagers had to leave it. The old woman's house was destroyed, and she got a shell fragment in her buttocks. He also commented that the people of the town said that the Germans that occupied the region in 1914 had not caused any serious damage. It was even with some pride that they showed a shed where the German Crown Prince himself had once parked his car. The poilus' stay in Dommartin was difficult. During those days the temperature stayed between 12 and 15 degrees below zero. Barthas wrote that one could only imagine the suffering this caused for the exposed soldiers in the trenches, and how it was an insult that in the rear, in places like Paris, people were complaining about there not being enough coal to heat their comfortable dwellings and cinemas. Anyway, the days passed, and on the 6th of February at nightfall it was Barthas and his team's turn to go to the front line. After passing through a village and some barracks on a hill, the poilus reached an elevation called the Promontory, where their brigadier general had installed his headquarters. Following a communication trench, the Pelouse climbed up one of its slopes, then climbed down the opposing side, and soon found themselves before a hill which was known as the index finger of the Hand of Massige. The Hand of Massige was a natural formation made up of 6 hills which on maps resembled the left hand. 5 of the hills formed its main fingers, and the 6th one had been called the false thumb. The hand marked the eastern limit of the Champagne front, and the ravines which separated each finger were full with cemeteries from French soldiers who had died there, particularly during battles that had taken place near the end of 1915. Barthas and his team relieved their comrades in an ice shelter within the false thumb. The shelter had wire mesh beds and a large iron drum in the middle, which was used as a stove. The stove was filled with wood the Pelouse stole from a nearby supply depot. Each morning, the team would move their cannon into its assigned position. To get across to the other side of the false thumb, there was a 150-meter-long tunnel through which ran the tracks of a light railway. On the sides of the tunnel, there were also very dark, damp galleries and rooms where entire companies were sheltered. Barthas and the others set up their cannons close to the front-line trenches, but had orders to only fire if the Germans attacked, which suited them perfectly. Throughout the day, one half of the team, led by Sergeant Gauthier, and the other half, led by Barthas, would take turns staying with the cannon, and in the evenings they would return to their comfortable shelter. A week passed like this, but then, on the 15th of February at 1 in the morning, the Pelouse were woken up by a violent German bombardment. They went out to see what was going on and saw shells falling everywhere, even near their shelter, which was normally a peaceful corner. This was obviously a prelude to a German attack. By dawn, the bombardment intensified even more. Shells fell heavily on the trenches, the hills, the villages in the rear, a hillock 400 meters away behind which the field kitchens were sheltered, everywhere. Then, at one point, the bombardment suddenly moved and became extremely violent at the positions of the 208th Regiment, located to the left of Barthas's own regiment. The bombardment decreased considerably in intensity on the positions of Barthas's regiment and became insignificant on the regiment to their right, the 13th. Barthas's gun had been installed within the 13th Regiment sector, so they managed to take positions and could witness the frightening bombardment on the other slopes and ravines, of a ferocity such as they had only seen at Lorette, Verdun, and the Somme. Exactly at 3 p.m., the German bombardment shifted to areas farther in the rear. Immediately, the Pelouse felt the earth shaking from the detonations of German mines across the front line, and soon after, waves of German infantry assaulted the 208th Regiment's positions. The soldiers of the 208th had been taking cover in their deepest shelters and quickly surrendered. Barthas and the others could see the columns of French soldiers being taken away towards the German lines. He wrote how those prisoners would be marching towards forced labor, hunger, and exhaustion in a foreign land, but that at least it was almost certain that someday they would see their families and homes again. The German reports of that battle later claimed that 1,050 prisoners had been captured. But, returning to the battle, the Germans quickly captured the first 2 lines of trenches of the 208th, but they did not push deeper. Instead, they tried to widen the break by attacking the positions of Barthas's regiment from the rear and flank. It was difficult for the 296th, but in the end the Germans did not manage to advance. Barthas wrote that apparently the Germans had been under strength, with only one of their regiments taking part in the battle. This whole affair had simply been a localized action that had taken the French completely by surprise. For Barthas, the most important factor in the Germans not being able to advance more was their own artillery, which fired short and created a wall of shell fire that stopped their progress. Barthas also wrote that during that battle there were some noteworthy examples of bravery. In one case, a machine gun sergeant of the 296th found himself with all his men killed or wounded and the Germans rapidly approaching. Still, the sergeant stayed there firing the machine gun until the Germans, who got as close as 30 meters, ran away. In another incident, a corporal of the 296th was suddenly called to surrender by a German officer. The corporal answered with pistol shots that scared the officer away. In another part of the battlefield, a captain of the 208th Regiment, together with a few men, including 2 squads of the 296th, found their positions completely surrounded. They held the Germans at bay from behind barricades of sandbags throughout the day, and when night fell, they managed to sneak out and rejoin the French positions. Barthas also mentioned that his old friend and fellow Paysan, Gabriel Gilles, was in the 208th Regiment during the battle. Fortunately, he managed to return safe and sound. From one day to the other, this attack changed everything. Before, only 1 battalion out of 3 was stationed at the front line at any given time. After the attack, the soldiers of all 3 battalions were crammed into the trenches with insufficient shelters. This, combined with the fact that the communication trenches had been completely destroyed or flooded at several points, forced the men to move around and carry out their work details almost completely exposed to enemy fire. They were also the recipients of frequent, unannounced bombardments. In one case, the 37mm gun to the immediate left of Barthas' zone was destroyed by a 105mm shell, though fortunately the team had taken shelter before it fell, and no one was injured. February 18th was the day Barthas' squad was supposed to go back for their 6 days of rest, but with the whole regiment in the trenches and on high alert, instead of returning to the village of Dommartin, they had to stay 1 kilometer behind the trenches in reserve. They were sent to the hill known as the index finger of the hand of Massige. Here, their Colonel Robert was installed. Apparently, it had been considered that the dugout the colonel was in was insufficient, and so some engineers were building him a newer and larger shelter. At the hill, Barthas met a corporal of the engineers and fellow Paysan called Louis Lalac. Lalac told him in shock that the value only of the materials for the colonel's new shelter was worth at least 10,000 francs. Barthas added a little note that Lalac eventually died in the final months of the war. Moving on, the police discovered that the index finger had vast catacombs that served as shelters full of hundreds of wire mesh beds. But the catacombs were in total darkness and extremely damp. The water would seep through the ceiling and walls and formed huge puddles on the ground. The humidity was particularly cruel on the soldiers with sciatica and rheumatism. Across the slope of the index finger, there were many, far more comfortable shelters with corrugated iron roofs, but, unfortunately, the German gunners that bombarded that hill were very skilled, and so most of these shelters had been abandoned for the catacombs. One of these open-air shelters in particular stood out. It had clearly belonged to someone important. It had a table, benches, beds, a window door, and a luxury rarely seen by the common poilus, a lamp with light. A shell had pierced the shelter's thin metal roof, and several times throughout the day and night volleys of shells would fall in front of the shelter barely 20 meters away, shattering crosses in a nearby cemetery and killing the frogs which lived in a pond and stream within the ravine. They were small shells of either 77 or 90 millimeters, but they could still kill. All of this explained why the place had been abandoned by whoever had been its original occupant. But this did nothing to discourage 4 French artillerymen who were fanatical card players and spent their days and nights there, playing cards by lamplight and ignoring the explosions happening all around them. Barthas and his teammates occupied a shelter near the hill's crest, where they thought they would be perfectly safe. But one night, a large 105mm shell fell barely a meter away from their roof and right into a neighboring shelter that fortunately had been empty. With this, the Pelouse had to leave for the damp underground catacombs, all the while cursing the German gunners. Barthas wrote that before the German attack on the 15th of February, the index finger had enjoyed almost complete calm. As it was an important point in the sector, it had been developed considerably. There was a rail station through which trench trains brought up tons of supplies, and which also served as a marshalling yard with lines that connected to many of the other fingers of the hand of Massige. There was a watering station with a motorized pump, and a generator that provided electricity for lighting up the shelters in the area. There was also an underground stable, with many small donkeys that were used for ration details and transporting supplies, together with 3 cows, which provided milk for the colonel and the sick men at the infirmary. After the German attack on the 15th, French Commander-in-Chief Robert Nivelle declared that the Pelouse had to retake the ground no matter the cost. Large artillery pieces mounted on tractors were brought up, and on the 23rd of February they unleashed a terrible bombardment on the German lines. Barthas wrote that unfortunately some of these heavy pieces aimed too short and hit the French lines, and he heard Colonel Robert say in rage that if they kept killing his men, he would hand in his resignation. A French attack was supposed to be launched right after the bombardment during the night of the 23rd to the 24th of February, but the regiment that was supposed to launch it was decimated by German barrages in the trenches on their way up to the front line. In a torrential rain, the battered men that survived had to pull back. The attack postponed. That same night, 2 Germans approached the Pelouse and surrendered. They were brought before the colonel the next day, and they explained how the French bombardment had devastated their lines. If they had attacked that night, they would have met no serious opposition. After hearing this, the colonel rudely dismissed them. That same day, Barthas and the other Pelouse rest ended. At 9 p.m. they went up and relieved the gun team at the front line to the regiment's left. About 600 meters from the index finger was a hill known as the Half Moon, where the regiment's field kitchens took shelter. Barthas and 2 of his squad mates were sent there, and they were lodged in cots in the underground galleries. Their task there consisted of bringing up rations to their gun team at the front line every evening. When they returned, Barthas would go to the index finger to give their sergeant's reports to Lieutenant Leroux. Normally, this would have been a comfortable and safe assignment, but after the 15th, this had also changed, and the German gunners paid particular attention to this area. The field kitchen's cooks there had very precarious shelters, and it took great courage on their part to not simply quit their posts. Barthas wrote that their own company's field kitchen was particularly exposed. Whenever shells started exploding nearby, the cooks and assistants would flee for the nearest cover. But one man always remained, Master Chef Morla. Tall and thin, with his ladle in hand, he would stay at his post with absolute indifference to the enemy fire. Barthas wrote that Master Chef Morla was a character worthy of being remembered for posterity. His food was not especially delicious or varied, though he always paid great attention to it. His usual pose was him holding the handle of his pot's cover, wreathed in steam and evoking the image of the smith god Vulcan. He alone determined the day's menu and based dishes entirely on his own experience. He would wake up every day well before dawn to make the company's coffee, and the making of this coffee was a sacred task which he allowed no one else to do. He presided over even the smallest distribution of food, and despite the daily fluctuations in manpower due to arrivals, departures, and casualties, no one dared to try and get some extra servings, as the master chef knew from memory exactly how much each squad was due. He was also the only one who would give extra goods from the kitchens. If someone wanted some garlic, an onion, or a mug of coffee, he had to present his case before the omnipotent chef, who would decide whether or not to give it, and his word was final. He had also been given the nickname Paper, though Barthas never learned why. For his courage and complete disregard for danger while managing his field kitchens, Master Chef Morla was eventually awarded the Croix de Guerre. And so was life at the Half Moon. One day, Barthas was returning from the field kitchens with the group's rations when, 50 meters away from his shelter, he was suddenly surprised by a volley of 4 105mm shells which fell around him. The concussion threw him to the ground, and for a moment he thought he was dead. His companions saw this happen from the shelter and were certain he had been killed. They rushed to his aid, but were surprised to see him get up by himself. There was not a single scratch on him, though the canteens and pots of food had been crushed and broken by the explosions. They had to go beg for food to the master chef, who generously gave them some leftovers. Again, Barthas had miraculously escaped unscathed from certain death. In the Half Moon was also stationed Louis Richardy, the chef from Peyriac Minerva who served Captain Adjutant Major Cros Meyreville and the Commandant. One evening, Richardy decided to invite all of the Palus of Peyriac for a small feast in his shelter, a ramshackle cabin for which it was only a matter of time to eventually be demolished by a shell. Still, Richardy thought that what was written, and there was no use fighting fate, so he calmly cooked there as if he had been back in his hotel in Peyriac. The Palus were beyond happy at finding themselves there, eating and talking among friends and comrades around a real table, forgetting for a moment their sad reality. They talked of their hometown, they gossiped about small everyday events, and they also talked about the sad stories of men who had died. There were many of those. Eventually the party ended with some nice wine. In the night, Barthas made his way back to his shelter together with another Peyriasa, a private from the 13th Company called Joseph Espagnol. The weather was freezing and the ground was covered in a thin layer of ice and snow. Joseph suddenly slipped and sprained his leg. Barthas supported the limping private back to his shelter, and he was evacuated the next day with his leg grossly swollen. Barthas wrote that he would be a man that would remember their party at the Half Moon Hill. And so the days passed. Since February 15th, the men were overworked and exhausted. Fortunately, through great effort, Colonel Robert eventually managed to make their regiment change places with the 29th, which belonged to the same division and had been occupying the sector of Ville-sur-Tour, 6 kilometers away. On the 2nd of March, at 9 p.m., the Palus headed out for this new sector under a driving snowstorm. The going was difficult for Barthas and the other members of the team, as they had to move their cannons on their own over an irregular log road which was splintered at several places. They passed through the ruined remains of 2 towns, Massige, for which the hand had gotten its name, and Virginie. Soon after, they reached Ville-sur-Tour, a sad ruin just like the other villages. Ville-sur-Tour was only a kilometer away from the front line, but it was considered a rest area. As it was Barthas's team's turn to be in reserve, they were led to a cellar among the ruins which served as their shelter. The place was quite peaceful. Each day the Germans sent about a half-dozen shells over there, and the French artillery replied with around the same number. A river cut through the village and fed some large swamps, which the Palus had to go through to get to the trenches. There was a particularly deep spot around 400 meters wide, which could only be crossed on some footbridges. To the sides of the footbridges were walls of gabions, wooden basket-like structures which were filled with earth and which were meant to protect the Palus from being spotted and shot at by the Germans. Unfortunately, the gabions were slowly sinking into the water all across the path, so that if the men went through them by daylight, they had to move quickly and hope the German machine gunners were feeling friendly. During their stay there were some victims, though not many. Barthas wrote that for himself he probably crossed those footbridges over 100 times, and only once had an incident. By that point in the war, Barthas's body was feeling the pains of 2 years in the trenches, so he had to use a walking stick. This walking stick, combined with the binoculars he got at Lorette back in 1915, and which he still carried around, apparently made a German machine gunner think he was an officer of some sort, and fired at him. The bullets whistled by Barthas's ear, but he managed to escape unscathed. In that sector, the Police controlled the town's church, and the Germans controlled the nearby train station. Barthas wrote how, when the parishioners returned to their church, they would find its bells hanging from an apple tree's branches in front of the colonel's billet, to sound the alarm in case of a poison gas attack, a purpose which Barthas seriously doubted the ones who cast those bells had ever imagined they'd serve. In the sector, the French and German field kitchens had set up shop on opposite banks of the river, almost completely exposed with nothing but a few trees to cover them. But, due to mutual agreement, no one fired on the other side's peaceful cooks. Between the two front lines stood a small roadside sculpture of Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary. Barthas wrote of how the two of them were riddled with bullets and stood there as if in silent protest. He commented that it was a powerful symbol, but also complained of how Christ was always called so powerful, yet he allowed all this suffering to continue on both sides. Later, one day, Barthas was returning from the front lines when he ran into Captain Cheffaut of his 4th Machine Gun Company. Barthas wrote that this man was a university graduate of some merit, but he was also a terrible alcoholic, sometimes acting far too friendly with his men, only to suddenly punish and load them with various tasks and drills. This captain had tried to exert his tyrannical authority over Barthas's gun group several times before, though he'd always been stopped by Lieutenant Loriot, who defended their autonomy. The captain stopped Barthas with a hand. "Corporal Barthas," he said, "I have to inform you that I am going to have you court-martialed for dealing with the enemy." This was such an outrageous accusation that Barthas thought it couldn't be serious. In all likelihood, the captain was just drunk and having some fun. "My captain," he said, "you're surely joking." "I am not joking," replied the captain. "There are 4 witnesses ready to testify against you." Barthas was getting impatient. "This is the first time today that I've been to the front line, sir. The accusation is absurd. Surely you're making a mistake." "Your dealings with the enemy were not here at Ville-sur-Tour. It was at Outpost 10 in Hill 193, back in Champagne." At this, Barthas could feel cold sweat in his face and a light trembling in his limbs. In a flash, he remembered those anxious 24 hours at Outpost 10, their barricade barely a few meters away from the German one, and their mutual ceasefire. He remembered when the drunk Lieutenant Loriot had snuck up on them, trying to find them talking with the Germans, and how Barthas had warned their supposed enemies of this. This would be an unforgivable crime for his superiors. And here, this mean-spirited and authoritarian captain was claiming he'd found 4 of his squad mates willing to snitch on him 6 months after those events. Barthas did a quick mental calculation. All the poor little kids of his squad from back then were either dead or had been shipped out. One of them, Delattre, had been captured by the Germans, but managed to escape from the prison camp and made it back to the French lines. Delattre had begged not to be sent back to the front, as if the Germans captured him again, they might take him before a firing squad for escaping. His pleas fell on deaf ears, and all his superiors did was change the name on his paybook. Delattre ended up deserting to Switzerland during one of his home leaves. The only other veteran of that squad, the Payruassa Paul Alpech, was at that point dying in a hospital in southern France. The only one that was left with Barthas was his buddy Jean, a machine gunner in the 4th Company who Barthas wrote would jump into fire for him. A bit reassured by this, Barthas replied to the captain, "Sir, who are these witnesses who dare to accuse me in such a way? I have the right to know their names. Show them to me, and I'll prove them wrong." "Fine," replied the drunkard captain. "I'll see what I can do," and he left. Immediately after this, Barthas went to find his buddy Jean, who was with his machine gun at one of the communication trenches. Jean had not spoken a word to anyone and was furious when he heard the accusation leveled against Barthas. "I swear," he said, "if anyone ever causes something bad to happen to you, I'll kill him." This moved Barthas deeply. They embraced and then parted ways. The drunk captain never bothered Barthas about this issue again, and so he remained safe for the time being. And here we reach the end of this part of the 15th notebook. We've seen quite a bit of the life for the Polouse in this part of the Champagne sector, which turned from peaceful to hellish in a single day. They have to live not only with the dangers of the war and shelling, but also with the dangers that can come from officers amidst their own ranks. Barthas has so far managed to escape unscathed from many life-threatening dangers, and we shall see what the Champagne sector holds for him in the future on the next episode. I'll see you until then, and I hope you all have a good day.